So nice to see all of you here for what I hope is going to be a interesting and entertaining presentation. Hope everyone's getting geared up for Pesach. We're just a couple days away. And I thought, what better way for us here at the Spanish and Portuguese get ready for Pesach than a trip down memory lane to Sir Moses Montefiore and to his diaries. Sir Moses referenced the Haggadah on several occasions in his diaries, and I thought it would be nice for us to raise your hand if you can hear me. Yeah, good. Okay, people can hear me. Okay, and to give everyone the to explore a little bit what the Haggadah meant through the experiences of Sir Moses. And my hope is that that will enrich all of our Haggadot as well. So there's a couple different things that I'm going to focus on tonight. We got about 30 minutes for the class, and to look at a couple different issues that come out of his diaries. Perhaps the most now, well, I'll start with pretext just to give a little bit of context for his diary. Is obviously a lot of his diaries have to do with his travels. In particular note is, of course, that he traveled on 7 occasions in the 19th century to the Holy Land. He was incredibly concerned with the welfare of the Jewish settlement there, and made the point to travel there on many occasions to distribute charity, and ultimately to help start building some infrastructure, some modern infrastructure, so that the Jews in Israel wouldn't just have to live off of charity, but hopefully could earn their own livelihood. One of the most famous remnants of those efforts are the windmill in Jerusalem that he built, or he had built, for so that they could grind their own flour. It turned out to not be the most successful of all of his activities there, but the windmill is actually still there. So so that's a nice part of the landscape now in Israel. Okay. So what we're going to look at, and this is where it becomes interesting in terms of his travels, is that he makes his way to and from Israel, obviously by sea, by the Mediterranean. He tended to travel kind of down through France and into Italy, and then from Italy to Malta, and then from Malta to Egypt, and from Egypt to Israel. That was kind of the path that he had to take, and he writes about those experiences, and we'll see that there's a couple of interesting things that relate to Pesach. So that's a bit of the preamble. So let's kind of dive into it. I want to share with you, this is probably the most famous Pesach entry in his Haggadah. This part we're going to read, we'll see actually is the custom of families within the Montefiore extended family. He didn't have any children himself, but an extended family, to read this passage at the conclusion of their Haggadot. I actually got the entry that I'm going to share with you today from Abigail Green, who's related to the Montefiore family, and she literally wrote the book on Montefiore. So she's a professor at Oxford. So I asked her to send me the diary entry. So I'm going to bring up the diary entry for everyone to see, and we'll see if anybody would like to volunteer to read the entry, to read something from 1827. So we're going back almost 200 years. Let me bring it up here. All right, here we go. Okay, so this is a copy of his diary entry. And we'll see if anybody would like to, in a moment, to see if they'd like to read it. But I'll just read the top line of it, where it says, Monday evening, 4 o'clock, 26 November, 1827, on board the Leonidas, right, by Captain John Anderson. Okay, so let's take a read. Would anybody like to volunteer to read?
About 60 miles southeast from Malta, since Friday last, we had encountered continual gales of wind with a heavy sea. Our ship, leaky? No. Leaky. The pumps being kept constantly at work. The gale of yesterday was allowed by the oldest seaman on board to have been terrific, attended by a most dangerous short sea running mountains high. About 10 o'clock, about 10 o'clock, the wind began to aback. After midnight, the sea became rather,
less agitated.
Okay, less agitated. This morning, the sky again assumed its most threatening aspect. Okay, dark. So it's just by Silvano's head. Dark.
Clouds.
Clouds? Okay. Dark clouds are rising in all directions. Captain, what's his face?
That'll be interesting, isn't it?
Somebody else wants to take over?
I will.
Okay.
If I can. Captain, I don't know what his name is, foretelling a repetition of the late dreadful weather. At this awful pause, a little before noon, I threw into the sea a small piece of my last year's Passover cake, laid by on the evening of the Haggadah. I guess he means the Haggadah, supplicating the Almighty to protect us and to avert the coming tempest, likewise to tranquilize the still troubled ocean between 4 o'clock in the evening. Between 4 and 8 o'clock in the evening. It is with the warmest gratitude I humbly acknowledge and bear witness to the Almighty's kind interposition in our behalf. The clouds which appeared to everyone on board so dreadfully threatening during the morning have, as it were by a miracle, dispersed, and instead of pouring their fury upon us, the sea also became every hour more and more tranquil. May I forever bear witness and forever bear in remembrance this merciful interposition of God, and annually while I live repeat this fact to these I may have the happiness of being surrounded by on the evening of the Haggadah, Moses Montefiore.
Right, and just read the next one as well.
Quarter before 8, the sea is smooth, moon and Mars smiling on us. Captain
Stars.
Anderson, huh?
Stars.
Oh, stars. Moon and stars smiling on us. Captain Anderson this moment entered the cabin and said, I have not seen a finer night out of the heavens for many and many a year.
Right. All right. Thank you. And Andrea has not seen this before. She's just really good reading 19th century. When I go to the archives, I bring her with me. So this is a beautiful story. He writes about the terrible storm. This was basically on his way back, and terrible storms that they encountered. And he describes here this like really strange act where he says he takes a piece of Passover cake, which is not, like cake made out of potato flour. He means the matzot. He takes a piece of matzah and throws it into the Mediterranean. And lo and behold, the storm subsides. And as the captain ultimately says, that he had never seen anything as nice a night as he saw at that time. So it's this great description here of how he finally cause the waters to be still. So the question really is what's going on over here with this custom of throwing in the matzah into the water. Now, this is a custom that actually seems to have been different versions of it. There were some people who tended, and there's records of this, particularly in Israel, not in ancient Israel, but kind of during this time, this early modern era, that there were people who would actually carry matzah with them wherever they went. And some people had the specific custom of carrying the matzah when they were on the sea, and then they would throw it into the water. And the idea was that it would make things calm. We have to remember that Montefiore's family had come from Livorno and had been traders. And so it's not a surprise that this would have been something he would have been familiar with, as probably many of these Sephardic Jews perhaps had this custom of carrying the matzah with them for this purpose. And it seems that he assumed this custom as well. Now, what exactly is the rationale behind carrying matzah with you for protection and even throwing it into the water? That's seems a bit unusual. And it seems to have to do with a few things. So if you look in the way that the matzah, there's different kinds of matzah. Let me start. There's different kinds of matzot that we eat. There's matzah we eat in general on Pesach, and then there's the matzah that we eat on the eve of Passover, right, during the Haggadah. And the idea is that a person is supposed to, that matzah you have at the Haggadah, ideally, this year it's a bit more challenging, right, should be matzah which has been watched throughout, that from the time that the grains have been cut, that they've been watched, that no water has touched them. So not only once it's been made into flour, but from the very beginning that they've been cut, that they've been watched, they've been protected from any moisture, that God forbid they should become chametz. And so that's what we call matzah shemura, which means the watched matzah. And if you look in kind of Sephardic writings, they often refer to them as the shimurim. They'll just refer to it. They don't even call it matzah. They just say, oh, the shimurim, which means the watched ones. But there's this idea, and this is where it gets really, I think, the meaning comes into this, is there's this idea that Leil HaSeder, that the evening of the Seder is Leil Shimurim, is the eve, not of the Shimurim, meaning of the Matzah Shmura, but the night of the watch, right? That it says in the Torah that it was on that night that God didn't watch, but God guarded. The word Shamur also means to protect or to guard. And that the eve of Passover is supposed to be a night where we are protected from dangers, as the ancient Jews were in Egypt, where they were protected from the plague, right? That the evening of Passover is forever a time where we should feel safe and secure. It's the Leil Shimurim, it's the evening of being guarded. And so there's this added element in the Shimurim, in the Matzah Shemura, that not only is it watched, but perhaps it also affords protection as well. And so there's this idea that if you take these Shimurim, if you take this Matzah Shemura, it can serve as a means of protection. And so, as I mentioned, some people have the custom to carry the matzah with them in general, but particularly some people have the custom of using it with the water. Now why throwing it into stormy seas? So this seems to have to do with a custom that you find of, or not the practice that we have, where the matzah is broken, right? The yachatz, where we break the middle of matzah. And in some communities that had a what's the right word? Had a notion or a symbolism of the splitting of the sea. And so then there's this kind of connection between the matzah and the splitting of the sea, right? The seas that all of a sudden were raging, and then were calm, and we were protected, we were safe as we walked through the sea. And so there might be this idea of taking the matzah, which has been symbolized with the breaking, and using that to calm the seas, just like the splitting of the seas had happened when we left Egypt long ago. Which is why perhaps the practice is, even to get a bit more detailed, if you want to adopt this, is that it wasn't just to take any matzah shmura, but they would take a piece of the afikoman. They would specifically take a piece, right? When you split the matzah of yachatz, the larger piece is set aside and is eaten at the very end of the Haggadah, right? So it's specifically that matzah shmura, which is symbolized of the splitting of the sea, that it was particularly that one that would be separated and kept for protection if one ever was in a stormy sea as well. And so that seems to have been a custom among some of the Mediterranean communities. The thing that's interesting to me that in my family is not from the Mediterranean, is that we also had the custom of saving a piece of the matzah of the afikoman always at the second night of the Haggadah. So at the end of the Seder, my father would save a piece of the matzah and would then hide it away. So he didn't carry it around with him all year, for when he got on a boat, but actually was saved. And the following year, when we burn our matzah, right, when we do the bior chametz, when we burn the chametz before Pesach, he would use part of that matzah from the previous year to kind of start the burning of the chametz. I always understood it that it had something to do with the idea of kind of connecting year to year, right? That you use the mitzvah of the previous year to prepare you for this new mitzvah of the coming year. Some people have a similar custom of using the leftover branches from the lulav to start their fires for the bior chametz as well. So there's this kind of idea of using mitzvot to do other mitzvot. But again, it seems with some of these Mediterranean Jews that they actually they saved it for more intentional purposes of doing this protection. And this is something that Montefiore recounts. And in fact, it was such a miraculous rescue that he designated that every year he would always read this entry from his diary at his own Haggadah. And as I mentioned, this kind of expanded to other members of his family and then down through the generations. And so today you have lots of people who are kind of associated to the Montefiore family somehow, who still read this particular entry from the Haggadah. I know from Abigail Green, she says that her family did it at the end of the Haggadah. I don't know if that's true with all the Montefiore-related families, but that's one kind of interesting episode from his travels.
Sorry.
Anybody have any questions so far?
Just from a Mediterranean Jew. When I was a child and we would fly back to Kenya after Pesach, my grandmother would give us a piece. My grandmother would keep some of the matzah of the second Seder and would give it to us. Never figured out what that was related to anything. I'm just saying.
They didn't stop you at security, I hope. Yeah.
Or something like that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Right. So, okay. So it's continued into air travel as well. Good. Okay. So I just want to share with you now a second piece as well that I want to think about with you. So this is a picture or an etching of a visit of Sir Moses Montefiore in 1840, as it says, landing in Alexandria in Egypt. It's a fantastic picture, right? Because it shows Montefiore looking incredibly British and Western, right? Of course, everybody else looks very Eastern, and behind him you can see Lady Judith as well as they're disembarking in Alexandria. And as I mentioned, his travels often brought him through Alexandria. That was one of the major ports. And from there, they would get the next ship that would take them onto the Holy Land. The reason that I wanted to look at this is that it raises all kinds of questions. But I'm going to share with you a couple excerpts from his diary that appear in Abigail's book about his experiences there, because he ended up being there for a couple of months. There were some conflicts going on in the Eastern Mediterranean. They couldn't travel, so he ended up having to stay in Egypt for a little while. And what he describes is that there were thriving Jewish communities in Egypt, and particularly in Alexandria. And there were actually different Jewish communities that were there. There were kind of the what we might call it, kind of the older Sephardic communities that were there, as well as newer Jewish communities that had been from the Western Sephardim of the Jews from Livorno that were living in Alexandria as well. And they formed two different Sephardic communities there. And he describes that actually, if you went to this kind of Western Sephardic synagogue, most people there were speaking in Italian, right? That was kind of the language of it. They were known as the Franks, right? That's how this community was known. And he was there over Rosh Hashanah and Yom HaKippurim. And he describes the service on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, which I think everyone's going to enjoy. And he says the following. He says, the evening prayers were extremely well read with great devotion, and many of the tunes were the same as in our synagogue in London, right? And so what he's describing here is many of the melodies he heard in Alexandria were the same as at Bevis Mark Synagogue, right? Which is cool, which is really great to kind of hear that. But get this, because he goes back on the Day of Atonement, and I'll describe to you what he says over here. He says the following. He says, this is just Abigail introducing the quote. It says, likewise, when he attended the great synagogue for the Day of Atonement, Montefiore remarked the prayers were, quote, well read and with devotion, but not in so solemn a manner as with us in London. And so, while the melodies may have been similar, they did not do it quite as well with as much as devotion as we do at Bevis Mark Synagogue. And Sir Moses would be proud to know that it is still the same at Bevis Mark's synagogue today. Said beautiful melodies with great devotion. And he ended up actually being there for some time. And I'll describe to you what he says at the end of this piece, at the end of the lecture. So the issue that I wanted to raise here was this issue of the fact that there were Jews living in Egypt, because I'm going to quote to you what it says in Rambam about this very issue, and that in fact it seems highly questionable, problematic, that you would have had Jewish communities in Egypt. And so I'm going to read to you here from the Mishneh Torah. This is Maimonides' legal work. His Laws of Kings and Wars, chapter 5, section 7. Would somebody like to read this in the English? Eddie, are you volunteering?
Well, it sounds like I've been volunteered. Okay, we'll have a go. It is permissible to live anywhere in the world except for Egypt, defined as the area extending west of the Mediterranean Sea.
Wonderful. 400. Okay, that's good, Eddie. So that's great. So the Rambam says very clearly here, you're not allowed to settle in Egypt, and he quotes several different verses to make this point. And I'll open up here the verse, okay? And he quotes the verse over here that says, that moreover he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses, since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again, right? And so Rambam understands from this verse that one is not permitted to return to Egypt. And so the question is broadly about how there could be Jews living in Egypt, but even more specifically, the question is, how could Rambam live in Egypt? Rambam's family had lived in southern Spain. They'd been driven out during times of persecution. They actually went first to Fez, then to Akko in Israel, and eventually settled in Cairo, where we know he eventually comes to work for the Sultan. But he lived many years in Egypt. He wrote some of his most famous works while living in Egypt, and yet writes this passage that you can live anywhere in the world except for in Egypt. So the question is what's, specifically with Rambam, but generally what's happening with Jews living in Egypt? We know there's Jews in our own community that their families come from Egypt as well. So the question is, how exactly was this permissible? So I'm going to share you one other Sephardic source about this. There's many sources about this subject, and this one's from the late 13th century, and it says the following over here. It says, and this is from Rabbeinu Bachia, who lived in Saragossa in the late 13th, early 14th century. Would someone like to read this source?
Okay, and the Lord has said to you, you shall not return again on this way. This commandment was valid only during the period when it was promulgated. It was intended to ensure that Israelites traveling to Egypt would not learn to copy the abominations practiced in that country, as the Torah spells out in detail in Leviticus 18:3. This does not mean that there is a permanent prohibition for Jews to reside in Egypt. Had the Torah intended these words as a permanent prohibition, it would be inconceivable that so many Torah scholars, pious individuals, made their home in Egypt after the destruction of the temple. Even if individual Jews had ignored this prohibition and settled in Egypt, the sages would have spoken out against this, and we would have records of their protest. The only people who were forbidden to dwell in Egypt were Jews who left the land of Israel to do so.
Okay, so Rabbeinu Bachia here.
Sorry, hold on a sec. Didn't you say that the Maimonides went to Akko first and then went to Egypt?
I did.
So
yeah.
Didn't he leave the land of Egypt?
Sorry.
Didn't he leave the land of Israel to go to Egypt?
He did. Yes. So right. So there's a couple points in this Rabbeinu Bachia which you point. One is this indication that the prohibition may only be if you're going from Israel to Egypt, but just going to Egypt is no problem. Or even this notion where he says that this may have only been valid for that generation, meaning that it was only valid during the period when this law was taught, right? Meaning that the Israelites were not permitted to return to Egypt, but not that it would necessarily be a prohibition necessarily for all ages. And so one way or the other, right, Jews throughout this millennia did not see this prohibition as applying to them, and therefore live there. The fact that Rambam says it does apply and live there is questionable. Some suggest maybe he went there not planning to stay there, and then ended up, the Rambam himself writes that you can go if you need to kind of go for business or for livelihood. So maybe he went there for a moment and then stayed, and that if you went there for a permissible reason, then maybe you don't necessarily have the obligation to leave afterwards. It's a bit tricky with Rambam himself, but clearly there is a tradition that says it was permitted to live in Egypt. You do find, and I'll just quote this, a similar thing happening with the Spanish and Portuguese Jews as well, with reference to Spain, right? Some suggest that there was a prohibition for Jews to go back to Spain. I'll try to bring up that source for you over here. I can just, let me try to open up this over here. Share a different page. Yeah. Okay, so this source is from 1677. Okay. Would somebody like to read this? This is from the Askamot, the Rules and Regulations of the Community, in 1677. I'll read this one since we're not getting any volunteers. So it says the following. It says, a circumcised Jew who goes to the lands of Spain and Portugal and later returns to Judaism from there will not be accepted in the community until he mounts the podium and asks publicly for forgiveness from the blessed Lord and from the congregation for the scandal he has committed, and he must obligate himself to repent according to what is imposed on him. Right? So we see here that there was a prohibition in the community from going to Spain and Portugal. Sorry, those who like to go to Spain and Portugal, because and that, in fact, if you went there, you had to kind of publicly repent in the community. So the question is, what's going on over here? There's no biblical prohibition to go to Spain and Portugal. But of course, at that time, it was prohibited to openly practice Judaism in Spain and Portugal. Certainly, if you had been born as a converso, as a Catholic, right? So any Jew who went, in a sense, back to Spain and Portugal meant that when they were there, presumably they weren't following the Torah, right? They were living as Catholics, right? So the community actually enacted a prohibition that said you couldn't go back to Spain and Portugal, because essentially, if you went there, that meant you were not going to be observing the Torah. And so if you did, when you came back, you needed to like publicly confess your sins to the community and repent for the things that you had done. It could be they also had concerns that if you went there and you interacted with other conversos and then you left, that some of those conversos would perhaps be taken in by the Inquisition. And so you were actually endangering other conversos by going back and forth as well. So there is a little remnant of this notion of prohibiting the places we've come from, where we've had troubles, as things, after we've left. Ultimately, though, and I'll just close with, I'll mention this, nowadays there's no prohibition. You can go to Spain, Portugal, and observe Torah there. And so this Askama doesn't apply, but it's perhaps an echo of that issue with Egypt as well. I'm really just going to close with one more point here, because there's this great line here that Montefiore says from his trips to Egypt. And he says the following. He says, no one will ever say the Haggadah with more true devotion than I shall do when it pleases Providence to restore me to my country and redeem me and my dear Judith from this horrid land of misery and plagues, the hand of God being still upon it. So he did not have a very favorable impression of his time in Egypt. He thought it was full of yellow fever, malaria, and disease. And he was very happy when he could leave. And he said that he would take that personal experience he had and really put that into his recounting of the Haggadah. And so we see that for him, he really took his own life experiences and used them to inspire his own Haggadah, whether it was his time in Egypt and thinking about the plagues, or his travels on the sea and the splitting of the sea and the safety of the matzah. That both of those memories he carried with him throughout all of his Haggadot. And I think that's just like a really wonderful message for all of us, right? That when we have the Haggadah, of course, we're reading what happened to the ancient Israelites, but we should be infusing our own experiences into the Haggadah as well, right? And using our own encounters in life, right, to add additional meaning to what happens in the Haggadah as well. And of course, this year, it's simple. We're all hiding in our homes from a plague outside. I mean, the resonance with the ancient Israelites is quite apparent. And so I hope that everyone is able to really connect with the Haggadah this year. And please God, as we say in the Haggadah, just as God protected our ancestors, may He protect us as well, and may it be a Leil Shimurim, a night of protection for all of us as we celebrate on this Pesach.